I'm Mike Rogers. As of March 30th, I think, I retired from the state after 41 years of service. I am possibly going back as part-time, so right now I'm a contractor. So we're going to be going over the law portion, and I'm not going to make apologetic or excuses for it. It's extremely dry. I mean, at times it's extremely dry. I'm going to go over the law course. Has everyone taken the law course, the basic 4-day law course? That seems to be the norm now. Most people come in here because I cover everything that's basically in the law, and then I highlight everything that's on the test. So people are getting, we only had 2 people sign up for the course this year. So they didn't offer it because of the attendance rate was so low. So I'm wondering whether, no. So have you taken the other basic courses? Most of you? No? Have you worked in municipal government, or, okay, so you have some familiarity with the processes. I refer to the law as, sometimes, especially when teaching it, it can be as dry as a tick on a dusty boot. So bear with me. If you don't be afraid to ask any questions or interrupt at the time if you don't understand something, and I will probably be telling you to use your highlighter or circle something anytime, and you probably should circle that if you're going through. And when you go into the exam, you won't be able to bring your law book in. There'll be one supplied with you, but by the time we get done today, or maybe even into early tomorrow morning, that on the review, you'll be able to look up most of the questions that will be on the test. And I actually have fashioned a quiz that we can take, and fashioned a longer one, which we condensed, that you can take home if you want with the answers. And most of those are pertinent to laws. I mean, this is almost impossible unless you've got a photographic memory or that, to memorize the law to the point where, you know, so I even have to look things up. Sometimes it takes me more than, 15 minutes or 20 minutes to locate a statute that I said, I know where it is. But, so.
You say you're going to be working from a 2017 book, this one? Do you know if there's changes between the 17 and 18s, or did you?
Nothing of any significance that will be on the test. There are changes in subtle laws, nothing substantive. This one on the computer screen may be the 16 version. I have a state computer here. I'm not a state employee, so I cannot log on without committing the network and download the most recent. They were going to email it to me, but I said, they said they did, but they said, we sent it to your state computer.
I think it's right online on the state's website.
Yeah, it probably is, but I don't know if the most recent version is. Title 36 is broken down to several chapters. The title, General Provisions. Property taxes is part 2. This is what the main focus of today is going to be. Part 3 is sales and use tax. We are not going to, we're not going to concern ourselves with that today. Business tax and so forth. So the main portion that we're going to is chapter 101 through 115. And we won't probably be touching on the unorganized territory because there's no need. The unorganized territory functions as the 489th jurisdiction in the state. You have 488 organized municipalities, cities, plantations, whatever, towns, cities, and plantations, and you have the unorganized territory. My department, the other sector of Maine Revenue Service, is broken into 2 sectors: municipal service, and then the second sector is the unorganized territory. And they have, half the state is in the unorganized territory, so which means they don't have a form of government, and so the state actually assesses values, discovers, and then assesses the taxes for their education, and the state runs the education department. They go to local schools, or there are some unorganized schools like Connor Township and Worcester County and so forth. So we're basically, municipal services in charge of the education program here, Jeff Kendall being the chief on training and certification. And formerly, I was in charge of developing the annual equalized state valuation. That state valuation is an audit of every town, city, and plantation in the state of Maine annually to develop an equalized value, because you're all assessing at different levels, and that will be discussed in the law portion anyway. It will not be on the test, but you're all assessed at different levels, and the goal of the state valuation is to equalize all towns depending on their markets, so we can distribute school subsidy, general purpose school aid, revenue sharing, and county taxes are based on that annual state valuation. So this Title 36 basically is in your volume 1, and it's broken down into several parts. I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I'm just gonna, in chapters, general provisions, the property tax administration, assessment and collection of taxes, primary assessing areas, cities and towns. These are the laws basically, or the sections that basically you work within, 501 to 1152, unincorporated, unorganized places, and the rest of the tax, the aircraft, the commercial fishing vessels, and so forth. You don't deal with that much, but it will not be on the test. So most of the test involves chapter 101 through 105. So, and that's broken down into the book. The best way I've found, unless they've tinkered with the index, is to look for keywords and questions and then look them up in here. There are some that are a little misleading, but most of them line up with the basic body of the statute and so forth. So let's get to the PT 102. And we have a copy. I have 2017 copies in front of me, and I believe mine may be a 2016, but it should pretty much line up. We have the table of contents, introduction to United States law and Maine law, the statutory constitution and so forth. It goes right through property taxes, 7, then exemptions, 8, supplemental assessments, abatements, appeals, miscellaneous provisions, which we probably will just touch on, but we won't focus on because it won't be in your future. Okay, so this is basically the publication is designed for 2 purposes: educational purposes, introduced for new assessors, and the laws covering the information concerning property tax administration. The legislature does amend, as we know, laws every year, and there are subtle changes that are not in this manual that I'm here, and possibly not in yours, depends on when it was printed, but they will not be covered on the test, because the test was not revised to suit current need. The test will be straightforward. It'll give you the information and what the exemption amounts, if it asks to calculate an exemption or something like that. it will give you the information that you need to calculate that exemption properly. It will give you the value of the exemption, which may not line up with current law, and the ratios and so forth that you need to apply to answer the question, so. Okay, the origin. Statutory references, and this gets a little lengthy and confusing. Key to reading legal citations. The most frequently used type of legal references in text is the citation, statutory citation. Okay, the Maine legislature codified in multiple volume sets called the Maine Revised Statutes. They took out the annotated statute, so they refer to it as MRS now instead of MRSA. Laws are divided into major subject areas called titles, which I just showed you the volume of titles that is available. And for example, Title 10 is concerned with laws that affect commerce and trade. Title 9 pertains to motor vehicle law. And Title 30A is a body of law that's concerning municipal government. Most municipal government laws, like who can be a selectman and an assessor, is actually in Title 30A, because that's municipal statute, not taxation. And the laws concern, Title 36, like I've said, contains the tax laws. Titles are divided into parts that in turn are divided into chapters, and in turn is divided into subchapters. For example, Title 36, Part 2, Chapter 102, Subchapter 5 is the logical sequence for arriving at Subchapter 5 assessment standards that is included in Chapter 102, Property Tax Administration of Part 2, Property Taxes of Title 36. Okay, so I can go to this manual, then go to here. That paragraph, Title 36, right? Does it say Part 2?
Yep.
Chapter 102?
Subchapter 5.
Subchapter 5, thank you. Assessment standards. I would have known that off the top of my head as being Title 36, Section 326. All these subchapters, that's the logical sequence for arriving at that. But if you look in your index, look up assessment standards. If you're asked a question on assessment standards, turn to the back of the law book. I'm just trying to simplify this process, because if you're trying to look things up by chapter, subchapter, it's going to be a very stressful test. And I don't want that. Assessment standards. They guide you right to what, 326 and 321? 331, excuse me. So if I had a question referring to assessment standards and I had to look that up, if a taxpayer called and was concerned with something, or an assessor called me, I would refer to this. Assessment standards I know off the top of my head, because when they were enacted was the reason I was hired back in 1976, 77, because there were, if you read the brochure, there were several of us, about half a dozen of us that retired. And out of that half a dozen, I think 5 of us had more than 40 years, well, 35 years or so of service. We're all hired at the same time, and back in the mid-70s, Maine went through was just going through revals because of these assessment standards, because assessments were on a basis of about 10%. And it was hard for even, I mean, when house values were, when houses were selling in the mid-70s, we'll say an FHA house, which was the typical norm back then, I affectionately refer to as a shoebox, the ranches or the split foyers. I grew up in one. They were selling for anywhere from $8,000 to $12,000 at the time, but the assessments were somewhere around 4,000. No, they may have been going for 14. Assessments may have been 2,000. So it was hard for taxpayers to distinguish if there was any inequities between properties. And the market was evolving, and property tax was evolving, and state subsidies were evolving, and plus school districts came into play. Back before, late 60s, and they started combining SADs. Didn't matter because you were all local taxes, but then when school districts came in, the distribution of state subsidies was impacting towns and how much they paid. So that became very necessary to up the level of competence of assessing, or the standards, so to speak, of the standards of assessing in the state of Maine. It started off at 50%. So 320 assessment ratio evidence, just for an example. Purpose of the assessment standards is to aid municipalities in realizing of just assessing practices without mandating different ways municipalities may choose to achieve assessments. Minimum assessment ratio by 1977 had to be 50%. Now, bear in mind that towns back then were probably anywhere between 8, some of them were 5% of value, and so 50% was quite a jump for a lot of towns to realize, and then it just incrementally went up 10% per year till a minimum of 70% would still exist. But most towns are more sophisticated with computerization and education processes. Most towns stay within the 90 or within 91%, so they can declare 100%, and that way they can get their reimbursements at 100%. Those homestead reimbursements, it's easier for the taxpayers to understand if they're getting their full homestead reimbursement, other than something that is a ratio. And the assessment standards had to deal with the maximum assessment rating and the employment of assessors. So we'll be covering this in detail as we go through the book. So that too, statutory references. That can be an easy way to look it up, but if you're in a test environment, I suggest that you look for a key word in the question and go to the index. And most of them will line up. You'll find something in that body of the question that will lead you to a statute, and all you've got to do is, put your spin on it, and you don't have to write down the whole statute. Answering the questions just by title and section, probably not do it, because the questions want a little bit more detail, but you don't have to paraphrase the whole statute. So in the 41 years, I usually use Title 36 and section. I've never gone to subchapter, even a couple of times when I'm writing responses to attorneys, so forth, I may go to the point of putting subchapter, subparagraph, and subparagraph, but very rarely. Okay, Ordinarily, part, chapter, and subchapter heading references yield to a uniquely numbered sections within that title that in turn may divide into subsections, paragraphs, subparagraphs, divisions, and subdivisions. For example, the law requiring business equipment to be depreciated under the code to qualify for exemption under Betty, which is Business Equipment Tax Exemption Program, is located at Title 36, Part 2, Subchapter 105, Chapter 105, Subchapter 4C, Section 691, Subsection 1, Paragraph F, Subparagraph 2, in Division A. Never, they're not gonna ask you to recite all that, believe me. Or even write that down, title and reference. So if you guys can focus on that and put me in the right, because I got an old processor and very little memory on board, so. So I'm gonna go to Title 36. What chapter? Did it tell me to go to 105?
Yes.
Subchapter
4C.
Subchapter 4?
Mm-hmm. 4C.
4C? Okay. Sorry, I also probably need hearing aids. 691. What was after 691? The paragraph. F, qualified property means tangible personal property. Subject to allowance of depreciation under the code. It goes to, after that it goes to F, then it goes to 2, hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
Then A. Okay. That's the logical sequence for looking up laws, but if you're versed in that, 41 years, I've always gone to 691 and read my way through it. I have the Betty law highlighted in red, green, yellow, and for my reference, so I can find things that so in this case, if I was looking on the index, I'd look for business equipment tax exemption program, 6651 through 6659. And if I wasn't in a test environment and I had access to a computer, I'd put in a word search for depreciation in that area on my Word document. That's how I find things quicker instead of sitting there. Most of that law that I'm way too familiar with, and basically can navigate it okay, but it's one of the most complex pieces of legislation that has ever been enacted for taxation purposes. And it's very, very hard to administer, even for the larger cities with professional assessors and finance offices and attorneys or counsel on board. They can even, come across the areas of debate or questionable assessments. On my exit interview, I mentioned that it was really a pleasure to work for Maine Revenue Service for 41 years, but I also suggested that we should have a third sector in the department. And if you've ever been involved in a larger municipality, you've seen Joe Sally come in and do a Betty audit, and it's pretty easy to discover some errors in Betty assessments, because comptrollers and businesses now give you, if they're filing this equipment, they seem to just give you expenditures list instead of exactly what is taxable under code, because it's no sweat for them. If they file it, they've done their job. And sometimes the assessing departments don't have the staff, or there's buried in 16 pages a thing where airline tickets for executives to go someplace, and accounts payable is what they give you for the year. And that's not all taxable property, that's intangible property, and that's not taxable. Or wiring to a building or something, or they put in, remodeled the office or something, that's not personal property. But it's just easy for comptrollers and a lot of these companies just to give you accounts payable list
Or
for
they
the
go
year.
the opposite way and give you only the things that they haven't already expensed off their books. If they've counted as expensed, does no longer have
Mhm.
value.
That
for
happens
their
also.
IRS reports,
Yep.
then they don't give you that either.
Well, as Jim has probably gone over, part of the assessor's job is discovery, and personal property is a major intensive, resource. It takes a lot of resources to do personal property correctly. That's why a lot of smaller communities kinda, I didn't see that tractor. You know, if I discover one, then I've gotta discover them all. But that's the real world, but, it's, property's all taxable unless specifically exempt, that's the line for the personal property can be huge administration headache, especially Betty. And, for years, I was telling them on the way out, we should have a third sector and have a reimbursement, Betty and so forth, auditors, because we're asking the people that do the annual state valuation to spend, more time doing Betty audits than they are doing state valuation audits. And I've always been more interested in having the towns assessed equitably according to value, so the funds can be distributed fairly and the county tax can be assessed appropriately. So it's just one more piece of legislation that is added to the duties of the assessor in municipalities. And I also did mention that, how easy it is for a lot of these overwhelmed assessors to take this list they filed and just says, well, it's on the proper form, it's all this, and most of it looks good. You just put it over to the right side, then enter it into the computer. It happens. I mean, it's human nature. I'd probably be guilty of the same thing. So we've taken a number of years to try to ease into what we call clawbacks for errors or something that was exempt because it affects your commitment somewhat. We don't really go in there heavy-handed, but we're starting to more and more because companies are getting more lax and lax with their declarations or their filings for petty exempt, but that's a whole different avenue.
I'll say things where they put in a security system, which is fine, but then they put installation costs or delivery charges in their list as well.
Yeah.
I will cross those out as I enter them into my systems and just not use them.
Yeah. I'll give you a case in point. The town of Washburn,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, has a lot of large farm equipment and field equipment, computerized, harvesters and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
They were not, up several years ago, they were not assessing personal property. And I was called up
Their mill
to.
rate got all messed up.
What?
That's why their mill rate's all messed up. It's like at 32 right now.
Wow.
Washburn's. It's
Yeah.
their 70% valuation and 32 mill rate.
Yeah. Well, they were assessing it last I knew. That they were assessing their tractors because most of the farms spill over or originate in Caribou,
Mhm.
and the equipment, they said, was stored in Washburn for the Caribou assessors' benefit, which it was. They have barns. I mean, these farms are huge now. No such, I mean, family farms have disappeared, basically. The multi-corporations now that own these things are very large operations. But we had one taxpayer that took him to court. Just one taxpayer. His goal, he actually had a very extremely modest house. And he had a veteran's exemption, and pretty sure he had PTSD too. But he, his goal was to get his taxes almost zip.
Right.
And so he actually took them to court and forced them to assess the property. And there was
Really?
millions
Okay.
of dollars of farm equipment that was taxable there. Most of it's Betty eligible because those operations turn the equipment over pretty fast
Mhm.
because they're very large operations. So when Betty came along, that's
Oh, okay, so-
But that's all the better, because then the more Betty equipment you have, the better for your
Yeah.
town, because if your residents aren't getting a tax bill on it, and you're getting more money from the state,
Yeah.
why wouldn't you want to,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. Oh, yeah.
I can
that's-
see the taxpayer's perspective on that.
Oh, yeah.
for sure.
Oh, yeah, I could too. And
Yeah.
I went up there and, cited the law to them and all that, and they wanted to avoid, the judgment in court that, they were violating their, when you take an oath to become a selectman assessor, you're to assess all known property, and I mean, this guy would bring in lists, and he says, no, I mean, a couple of them were farmers, so they couldn't kind of ignore it, no, I don't have any equipment here, but that's small town politics, that's the
Mhm.
real world, and there are
But
many
there-
towns that just
There
avoid.
is a legal court case that supports that the town should be doing all this, I guess.
There are court cases,
Okay,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah. Your attempt, some of them artificially, I mean, you can't enact, we'll get into that, but you cannot enact statutes and say, but some towns have, if it's gonna cost more to discover, assess, and collect, discover, value, and assess, and collect, then we're gonna do it. We're not gonna just ignore it.
Right, that's what we're at, that's what
Yeah.
it works on. Okay, interesting, very interesting, thank you for going through that with me.
Yeah, and in state valuation purposes, if a town does not assess any personal property, unless it's maybe Garfield Plantation or someplace where I know there's no business personal property, or likely no logging equipment, because the assessors are my field agents, my co-workers, which I'm gonna hopefully become one of them pretty quick. The auditors, when they're out there, I tell them, if there's logging operations or excavators or something like that in the town does not assess contractors, does not assess that.
Mhm.
We add in an estimate on the state valuation for the purposes of equity for other similar towns. Similarly situated towns with a population which they have geographical territories, and they can tell me, well, this town is similar to this town in makeup and so forth. And we may be off by a logger or a contractor or two, but it's pretty fair, and it's never been appealed. But just for equity purposes on the state's side, I do add in a number, or I did add in a number that will be Joe Sally's responsibility now, for equity purposes, so.
Sorry for using up all that time there, guys.
All relative.
Okay, there's also private and special laws. For example, a bill that would allow municipality to vote to secede from one county and become part of another county would be enacted as a private and special law. The town of Otisfield prior to the 1976, 77, when the Cumberland County Civic Center opened, I think, was actually part of Cumberland County. The town of Otisfield is in Oxford County now. They did not want any part of being part of the Civic Center and paying the county, the increase that it would cost to maintain the Civic Center and so forth. So they opted in their legislative representatives, and that approached and submitted a bill to the legislature, and that was a private and special law. And they seceded and they were placed into Oxford County because they're more economically and geographically connected to the South Paris area than they are downtown Portland, if you know where Otisfield is.
We have a chunk of gray that's wants to do that, right?
Yeah, oh, yeah. Yeah. There are parts of towns that sometimes want to do that, go to a different county or go to a different town, and or become a town. I mean, so it takes a private and special law. Last town to successfully secede was either Fry Island or Long Island. Fry Island was in the town of Standish. It is now a town with a year-round population of zip because they shut the ferry down. But they say they have 3 residents. I went to the first selectmen's meeting and 2 of the plates were Connecticut, but it'd be nice if you registered your car, but they have one that lives in Sanford but claims his residence is Fry Island. But the legislature allowed that, and Long Island seceded from Portland back in the early 90s,
So did they
95.
become their own, like, town?
Town, yeah, they're a town, they're incorporated as a town, yeah.
What does it take to do something like that? I
An
mean,
act of the legislature, a special, private special law, and legislative approval, and usually it's just, Peaks Island was the last one to try unsuccessfully because of they're so tied to Portland sewer and everything else. Police, they get quite a bit of services, and they actually probably wouldn't save that much money, but they feel that island living's a little more expensive, and they figured they could probably run themselves a little bit more effectively than the city of Portland does.
So did they set their own evaluations and everything, and then the
Well,
state
they're a town.
auditors come in
No,
and do, like, value it?
when they become a town. But those islands are part of Portland. Along Peaks Island is part of Portland, Cushion, and so forth. Shabig Island also seceded from Cumberland more recently than the other 2, most likely. Then we have towns that go in the other direction, the plantations, that want to deorganize
Right.
because of, economics, liability. If it's just for tax reasons, usually the legislature doesn't look, but it's more involved than just tax. The town of Oxbow, plantation of Oxbow, recently deorganized because they're just literally dying in southern Worcester County. They're one big business. They had the Oxbow Lodge that burnt, and it just wasn't feasible for the person to rebuild it back. And there's just school population, children have just disappeared basically. Population is aging. Bancroft in southern Aroostook County. There are a couple of other plantations, Kerry Plantation in southern Aroostook County on Route 1. And the administrator for the UT, financial administrator, which is in the budget department, said, that's a Route 1 town. That can't be deorganized. That's too large. And I said, you ever drive to Kerry Plantation? Drive through it. You tell me how large it is. I said, the census, I don't know where they counted, what they counted in some of these towns, but Drew Plantation should think about deorganizing, and they are, but that's going in the other way because the economy, the forest industry has somewhat died or has declined to the point where it's not viable for young families to live in the area. So Those are deorganizing. So those are private special actions from the legislature that only impacts a certain population. In addition, the legislature also passes resolves that generally are acts that relate to limited purpose and do not require amendments to general law. For example, the annual legislative authorization to reimburse municipality for taxes lost, it should be effective taxes, lost as the result of Maine tree growth tax law resolves. So annually, they have to vote on a resolve to reimbursement. So legislature sets the amount of annual reimbursement that they take our, consult with us, and we give them projection numbers, and they decide and they vote on the annual budget, we'll say, to reimburse towns, and then it's distributed on a formula similar to the revenue sharing formula. Not quite, but it's got a few more steps. It's much more complex than the revenue sharing formula, but it's similar to that, which distributes the reimbursement based on the effective loss of tree growth value. Now, if you're a coastal town and you have the bold coast of Maine and these mega estates in tree growth, it does not cover the actual loss in taxes. That's why it's called the effective loss in taxes, because it's based on the excess acreage rates, either that the town uses or the annual state valuation uses to adjust the undeveloped acreage rates. It's very complex. You won't be tested on it, thank God, because it takes, I have to open up the legislation and the spreadsheet if I'm going to explain it to anyone for what the reimbursement is, and it simple error corrections incorporated by the reviser's office, such as renumbering two sections with the same number enacted during the same legislative session, are noted as reviser's report RR. So those are just resolves to resolve an annual issue or a incorrect duplication. Court cases are identified by name of case, such as Dilling versus Johnson. Cases are cited in the form of plaintiff versus defendant. Plaintiff is the person that brings the lawsuit against the defendant. Generally, the plaintiff is the party who initiated the suit. In the cases appealed to the Maine Supreme Judicial Court, the plaintiff is generally the party who lost the case in Superior Court. Okay, you don't need to know before 1966, unless you're really going to delve into the legislative process and the Okay, a complete up-to-date set of the Maine revised statutes, and they left the annotated, are available at most libraries across the state, especially the law library at the University of Southern Maine. It's a good place, but these law libraries have the red books. They used to be in most municipalities, but most municipalities don't want the expense anymore. They can get on LexisNexis and look things up if they want, and Google things and be amazed what you can, without going to the library. I mean, if you know what you're looking for, but administrative rules. Okay. Administrative rules is a form of citation format for administrative rule is 18-125 CMR, Code of Maine Rules. 205.2. The first set of digits is the agency. Unit numbers in the case 18 identifies the Maine Department of Administration and Financial Services, better known as DAFS. That also is the department that we're just Maine Revenue Service. We're under DAFS, the Department of Administration and Financial Services. 125 denotes the Bureau of Revenue Services, or Maine Revenue Services. That's the code that we have. The CMR is the abbreviation for Code of Maine Rules. And 205.2 identifies the section 2 of chapter 205, which is Maine Revenue Services regulation with dealing with the specifics of assessor certification exams or the CMA test. When this uniform numbering system provides a logical method by which the state arranges and cross-indexes and references citations with codes. Administrative rules carry similar weight as law. It's how we operate and define statute. I mean, when the assessment standards were passed, which was in 326, 327, dealing with the training of assessors, we had to set up rules, so we could, guidelines, so we could define, to carry out the wish of the legislature, or the direction of the legislature, not the wish, the direction of the legislature. So we operate under administrative rules. Administrative rule for developing the equalized state valuation, there's a set of rules that we apply to every municipality when we develop the equalized state valuation. They carry similar weight as law. They're posted annually, and the legislature and people can go in as they can and testify if they want during the hearing process, and there's a time frame to submit things or to request to testify in person. Most people do not, because that's kind of a smaller part of the legislative process. But the annual tree growth rates are under administrative rule. They get posted every year. The executive branch has to sign off on it so the legislature can hear it, and then they have to post it a certain amount of time just in case there's any public feedback.
Mike, is a lot of this like foundation building just to help us be able to find things quicker in here, or is there a chance that the test might actually say, okay, here's CMR, what number is the,
The test is not gonna cover that.
Okay.
It's a foundation. If I sat here and just covered everything that was on the test, you'd be here for about, 4 hours tops.
That's how
And,
long the test is, right?
yeah, you get 4 hours. Some people can finish it faster. It's an essay test. You don't have to write volumes, but you do have to explain your answer. And we'll be going over a lot of general similar questions that you'll see Friday later. But if I just sit here, it's just gonna shortcut things, and people will not be taking the basic courses. He says, well, they're gonna give us all the information. That means you've just got enough knowledge to pass the test. You don't get exposed to anything else, and then you hit the street and say, I'm a CMA. You should, you can hire me and I know what I'm doing. Then you get out in the real world and you go, oh, I still trip across things after 41 years that I have to sit down and, okay, just give me a day or two by myself and I'll get you an answer and figure this out. But, I mean, especially with TIFs and other things, tax increment financing and issues with administrating, there are commitment issues, but things don't get resolved like that all the time, but I don't give answers all the time unless I research something. So it's basically just giving you a foundation of the law course, and I mean, you're gonna go away with information to be very successful as long as you don't have severe test anxiety. I mean, on Friday morning, which, I mean, I'm subject to it. I mean, you blank out sometimes. You hit one question, you go, oh God, this is the first one, and I'm drawing a blank. Just take a breath, go on to the next one, then you'll come back. You will get all the information you will need to be successful on Friday morning. And I'm gonna recap it and review it after we go through this, but if I don't go through this, I'll be doing a disservice. It's, like I said, it's that tick on that dusty boot. It's dry.
Nobody's falling asleep yet.
Yeah.
Save that for 1:30.
Pardon me?
Oh, I'm saving that for about 1:30. I think I'm gonna be like,
I'm sorry, I should have taken this down.
oh, you can't. No, we've tried many days.
Oh, okay. Maybe I should be using the mouse left-handed. Introduction to United States law and Maine law, constitutional law, the citizens of the state nation. I'm pretty sure this is under Chapter 1 in your course manual, not the law book, but the PT 102. The pages may be a little different. Just tell me if they are, so I'm not talking and everyone's going, where is he? As citizens of the state nation, we conduct our lives and pursue our livelihoods within the context of legal authority, within the confines of statutes, hopefully. The vehicle of authority is the political phenomenon we call government. Government is a network of institutions and regulations designed to secure and preserve the common good, and the foundation is constitutional law. You're always hearing about constitutional battles, especially of late with the right to bear arms and so forth. So I'm not going to get into any political discussions, but the foundation of the Constitution. And that right to bear arms was there because we didn't have a militia at the time, and we were becoming a colony. So it wasn't a paid militia at the time, so we wanted our citizens armed just in case the British came back. The idea, for most Americans, the idea of the Constitution conjures up images of tattered parchment and calligraphy. Commonly, the common notion of the Constitution is often that of a written document, but is not always the case. British explorers who colonized the Atlantic seaboard of North America were governed by the English Constitution, an unwritten set of understandings, common practices, and accepted principles born out of the England's feudal tradition, lords, kings, lords, and so forth. The American colonists established a tradition of rugged individualism, which fostered predisposition of constitutionalism and formal adoption of explicit restrictions of authority of government. Founding fathers sat there, and the philosophy was they didn't want government to run people's lives. I know we're a polarized country now. 50% of us believe that the government runs our life, and 50% believe that government is there to protect us. But again, we can stay away from that. While thought of the unwritten Constitution might seem odd today, the concept of written Constitution was actually a novel idea back in the 1700s. Plus, they were enjoying the beer that they were drinking at the time. In fact, the Constitution of the United States was first written constitution in the modern world. It is now the oldest reflecting philosophy of individual freedom and limited government that exists. Okay. There will be nothing on that on the test. So if you want to read on and learn more that you may have forgotten during educational seminars, schools, or secondary, post-secondary education, you're more than willing to. The principal statutory law in the legislative process. I'm at the bottom of page 6 here. Is it similar on yours?
Middle of page 9.
Really? Yeah.
They make it fun.
Oh yeah, the font's huge now.
Oh, okay. Okay. That's good. Good for me. Maybe I should be reading from the book. Or going through the book that we have highlighted. They didn't bring enough PT 102s, that's why I'm referring to this. I have two 17s in front of me, and the rest of the 18s have been passed out, so apologize. If anyone gets lost or this does not line up, just please interrupt me. Maine laws, the principal source of law is the statute. Modern statute law is characterized emphasis on detail and extensive use of definitions. It is designed to address many situations, everyday relationships between citizens, government, and business, because there's commercial law and intercommerce laws and so forth. As legislators attempt to address the problems of dynamic and changing society, energized by the general and specific interest in constituencies, a continuous revision of the law occurs. There's always lobbyists lobbying the legislature to either change a law or revise a law. Sometimes it's the lobbyist, usually if they approach the legislature, it's usually to advantage a business or something like that, or change a law that impacts the business world or taxation, within taxation or something. Most representatives, when they submit laws, are more general for the public at whole. But lobbyists usually, they're working for a specific group of faction individuals. Whether you agree or disagree, that's their job. Maine law are published in several volumes called the Maine Revised Statutes, annotated in the most recent version that constitutes the 10th revision of the Statutes of Maine. It was adopted in 1964, replacing the 1954 revisions. Authorized by resolves, which we spoke about as private, in 1963. Okay, so when I'm looking up statutes, I mean, most of the time I go to the computer because it's easier and it's in a larger font and I can read it, and I can usually read search, but statute search, the list of titles, Title 1 through 36. I just have my Title 36s bookmarked, favorites, whatever browser you use and what they call it. And these are all these statutes and titles that refer to government. I mean, 29A refers to motor vehicles. We'll be talking about a statute probably in 30A, which is municipal and county government. 36 is taxation, like we've discussed. The Maine Constitution, which we'll be covering in a second, is also on this page. You can get to this quick, like the statute search right from maine.gov on the legislative. Just click on the legislative and it's right there. You can actually look up current bills that are submitted to the legislature, but I access it through that, but I've got it saved as a favorite because I'm in there all the time. And there's your articles of the Constitution. Okay, historical notes, library references, notes, Notes of decisions. In the Maine Revised Statutes, which is good if you're into a real legal situation, which is not gonna happen Friday, but I mean, if you're into people taking a municipality or your municipality to court over something, you may wanna get the revised statutes, the red book out, and look at the footnotes. At the end of each statute, there's law cases, and they have notes on those decisions, and those usually are from foundation cases, which all law is based on, and the courts will be looking at the same thing. But you'll, no need to, they're in little footnotes at the end of the statutes. As we discussed earlier, the organization of statutes is designed to separate ideas by structuring provisions with a uniform numbering system using the following mechanical form of the citation. Section 2 means subsection 2, the C means paragraph, the 4 means subparagraph, the E is division E, and the Roman numeral 6 is subdivision 6. None of this. This is the legislative process down here, ought to pass, ought not to pass, that is not on the test. If you're interested in the legislative process in any great detail, I would suggest reading this and maybe attending a couple of sessions, following a bill of interest through the legislature, which is, if you're in post-secondary school education, which is a good thing to do a thesis on or something, if you're really into that stuff, but it's also dry. Can be at times. Judicial law, case law. The task of determining the validity and meaning of legislation is a general judicial function. There's, levels to government: executive, judicial, state, county, town. The task of, in that capacity, the court's interpretation of the statute can certainly shape the effectiveness of the law. Nevertheless, regardless, it is a general accepted principle that statutes cannot be altered by a court decision, and it is also generally conceded that legislation authority is superior to the court. The function of the court is to interpret the legislation. Although there is no universal agreement on the limits of this authority, judicial authority also includes the power to strike down a statutory provision that is deemed to be unconstitutional and clarify or expand upon the meaning of a vague statute, and as well as to overturn the prior ruling of a court. Let's see, without getting into, we'll go into one this is not on the test. We'll go into a statute that was overruled in court. Back before 1980, the veterans exemption was, we'll say $4,000. I think it was $4,000, $3,500 something. Anyway, that's irrelevant. You had to be a Maine resident for 10 years before you received a veterans exemption. So with the evolution of society, people that retire like to move to Maine. So we have a lot of out-of-staters who entered the service from out of state. They were required to live in Maine for 10 years before they could receive a benefit for veteran exemption. First of all, you had to be 62 years of age, so if they moved in when they were 62 or around retirement age, we'll say, and they had to wait 10 years. Reverend George Lambert, or Lambert anyway, and I can remember the name because he's from a town I used to live in Wells, Maine, appealed that to court. And went all the way to the law court, and the court, Supreme Court, excuse me, deemed that to be unconstitutional. So they couldn't change the statute, so they were no longer eligible for a veteran exemption for a year. Legislature went immediately back to work after that case was settled in '81. So in '81 session, they enacted the law that they struck that out of non-residents upon entry into service. And they incorporated a new statute. Okay, so this is 1981. So 1981, a brand new statute they enacted that allowed veterans, regardless of where they entered the service from, what their residency was at the time of entering service. Because it was found out making non-residents wait 10 years, or possibly 10 years, or require them to live in the state of Maine for 10 years before receiving that. So that was a constitutional amendment. And that was, the law court struck that down as being unconstitutional. Legislature agreed that, well, we may have erred at the time that we passed this, been more zealous. And well, part of the reason was Maine residents received a free fishing license or hunting license when they returned from Korea. In other, Massachusetts and other states gave them monetary $500 or something like that, but we passed them a free fishing license. So legislature had that in their memory or something, and back when they enacted the law originally, says, well, we should make, non-residents were paid. I know other states gave them money, so they should have to wait before they impact the tax base of these municipalities by getting that exemption. And that was before the assessment standards and really took effect, so it impacted somewhat, but regardless, that was a constitutional amendment also, because in 1978, which we'll cover, the legislature passed, towns were getting nervous and MMA was in its infancy and just evolving to the point where they were major lobbyists for the municipalities, and they were saying, there's too many exemptions on the books. It's impacting tax bases of municipalities. So if you pass any new exemptions or amend any statutes, and you have to reimburse municipalities at least 50%. That's where your Betty reimbursement of a minimum of 50% comes from. And if you've ever filled out an MVR for a town, there's all kinds of veterans lines. You get reimbursed more for residents that entered from outside the state of Maine because of that law change. You get 50% for them, but Maine residents were already, so at $4,000, the first, that's complicated, there's a whole page on the MVR of veterans. Most towns just lump them into one that they come across. They're all the same, they're veterans, they're in my town, but there's actually different levels of reimbursement. It doesn't amount to a lot in most towns, but it amounts to half of $2,000 and half of $4,000 or $6,000 in most cases.
So every time like the homestead exemption benefit amount changes, is that through a revision that happens, or?
Yeah, legislation, yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
considered
Yeah.
a revision?
Yeah.
And they just don't ever think that a veteran's exemption should, everything else goes up with inflation, and that's been the same since the 80s. It's kind of.
Well, it was 4,000, it was 3,500 originally, and I think it went to 4, then it went to, may have gone to 5 for 1 year, then it went to 6. So, I mean, it went from 4 to 6 maybe, but.
How long ago was that?
A number of years ago. I don't remember exactly, but the veterans, the VA is the one that lobbies for that. And
Not successfully, no.
it's amazing in the VA, if you ever, I was present during one thing in the Veterans Association, the VA was, they were contemplating on letting all service members become veterans instead of having been in the service during a federally recognized conflict or war period. But some of those veterans that were in charge were dead set against it. So, that's the VA. We work by the direction of the legislature. We'll get into that here pretty quick. But Maine Revenue Services exist and operates under the direction and convening of the legislature to enforce these laws and to run state government. So, usually you can have a debate, I mean, you can debate things with anyone, but if you want something changed that you think is unfair, you should contact your local representative. Maine Constitution provides a judicial power and shall be vested in the Supreme Judicial Court. And the Supreme Judicial Court, established in 1820, consists of Chief Justice and 7 Associate Justices, holding office for a term of 7 years. That is also not on any Friday discussion. Administrative rules, it is not uncommon for the legislature to address an issue by enacting a statute in which wording is necessarily broad and general. In doing so, the legislature exercises its prerogative to delegate detailed decision-making authority to career professionals within the executive branch. Although recent trends indicate the tendency to limit administrative authority through greater specificity in the legislation and policy implementation function of the government agencies frequently requires clarification and definition of legislative intent. As I mentioned, the assessment standards in the state valuation, the state valuation statute is very broad and it's not defined, so we have a code of Maine rules that we present to the legislature and have to get approved to develop the equalized state valuation. It's about 6 or 8 pages long. It's right on our website, 201, I think rule 201A or 201. Anyway, and that defines how MRS and its field representatives visit the towns and conduct the annual state valuation, which goes into your subsidy levels and county tax. Legal opinions, because statute law is sometimes written broad, perhaps even ambiguous terms. Questions frequently arise on the specific situations relating to the application of the law. Sometimes these questions may warrant a legal opinion. In such instances, government has 2 options. In some cases, Maine Attorney General may be called upon by either the executive or the legislative branch of government to provide a legal opinion. 5 MRS Section 195 is a written opinion of the Attorney General, which usually takes form of a legal brief which states the facts of the situation, phrases of legal questions which must be answered after citing the appropriate legal reference. These questions are usually constructed in such a way to elicit a yes or a no response. Answers to the questions 4 supports the answer with the appropriate legal reasoning, which often employs judicial concepts of precedence and analogy. As a second opinion, but not under careful specific conditions, the governor, the Senate, or the House representatives may solicit an advisory opinion. That is going on with the Medicaid law right now. I mean, okay, rules of statutory construction. Language is clear. This is also not on. Maine constitutional property tax provisions. This likely may be in your future. Likely may. Is that a conflict? Shall, likely.
Most likely.
Absolutely.
Reading too much law.
Highlighters are appropriate. The Constitution of the state of Maine consists of several broadly stated guidelines pertaining to taxes in general and property taxes in particular. This chapter will examine the importance and the meaning of the provisions because they serve as the legal foundation of property tax in Maine. Maine became the 23rd state of the Union, and which was admitted by Congress on March 15, 1820, signed at the Jack Jameson Tavern right beside L.L. Bean in Freeport. Just for a footnote, if you're in there having a beer, there was history. I think it closed for a short period, but I think it's reopened now.
I was there a week ago. Excellent attic sandwich.
Really?
Excellent.
Oh, yeah. It's good to know. The act of separation between Maine and Massachusetts provided the laws then in force in Maine and remain in force until altered or repealed by the Maine legislature, except for those laws which were inconsistent with the situation and condition of said new state and repugnant to the Constitution thereof. Okay, so we separated from Massachusetts. We were part of Massachusetts at one time. That's why we're called Massachusetts Playground. And we adopted most of their laws, and most of laws sometimes go back in court battles to Massachusetts law, unfortunately, especially when it comes to access to so-called public beaches. Moody Beach and Wells, and which is in between Wells and Agunquit, is a case in specific, and there's another one in Kennebunkport that evades me right this minute. I even grew up in the area, but with the intertitle, who owns the high water mark and so forth. So the residents of this stretch of beach in Moody won the case, and they have, their property goes down to the high water mark, low water mark, and they claim access to it. And there's all kinds of signs on there. There've been all kinds of signs since the 60s, since I lived there. So, but we'd always set up the volleyball nets right in front of them, and just being adolescents. And back in the 60s, we were rebels. And we'd play volleyball, and they could shout all they wanted. And the police didn't come down there because it was ridiculous, because there were millions of beachgoers, thousands, a year down there. But they'd spend all their time down there. But they succeeded in their court case, and they own the stretch of that beach. So that's some of the Massachusetts law that they referred back to for those. And Maine embarked on property tax administration life with the body of Massachusetts law, like I said. Article 1, well, main, 3 tax-related sections. Article 1, Section 22, Article 9, Section 7, and Article 9, Section 8. Article 1 specifically states, no tax or duty shall be imposed without the consent of the people or the representatives of the legislature. So you cannot. Then Article 9, Section 7, which is very confusing, but while the public expenses shall be assessed on estates, a general revaluation shall be taken at least every 10 years, 1951, Maine enacted the sales tax, which was 2 or 3%, maybe 2, I think. 1969, income tax. Income tax hasn't been around that long, but long enough for some of you. But before that, there was a state tax. The state leveled to run state government. The state leveled the tax on each town. Each town's back in the 50s had, and they did a general state valuation every 10 years. Towns were responsible for doing a general valuation every 10 years. Do not confuse this with the town needs to do a revaluation every 10 years. It does not. Equity and your ratio level in equity supersedes anything that is in that Constitution. That Constitution relates back to the state tax, where the state would come in and collect money yearly, but they had to have a general evaluation every 10 years to make sure that things were equitable. They were not, but it was, back then, things weren't as sophisticated as they are today. And so there is no requirement for a town to do a revaluation every 10 years. Each commitment is a new commitment and basically a re-evaluation. Every time you commit your taxes, a general list, it's an evaluation. The things that are most paramount is your assessment level and your level of equity. I mean, up until 2 years ago, when Pownell in Cumberland County, right west of Freeport, very sleepy little town, which hasn't been overdeveloped like most Cumberland County towns, or didn't see development. The reason why is couldn't get a hold of the planning board. It was by design, believe me. When I do the state valuation there, no one would answer no planning board. Yeah,
That sounds like my town there.
yeah, a couple of, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of pressure on the southern Maine, more than Perham, to be developed. But their planning board was quite, and their selectmen were, no, they liked their rule setting, and they had very low values, land values especially, because they valued their open space. I mean, at times they had $100 or $200 per excess acre for values. So I didn't have any tree growth, because tree growth rates were higher than excess land values or undeveloped land values. So up until their most recent reval, they just had a reval a couple of years ago, I think maybe last year or the year before, I think. So they were at 45% at the lowest, I think. They're all very little commercial property in town. There are some, but very little, and mostly housing. So their landowners were undervalued compared to their homeowners who had just a house lot. And their house lot values were very nominal also, I mean low. But
Yeah, but they're
their
building
level of
this-
equity was ranged between 10 and 12, which is excellent. So the state, so in the case of Pownell, where their equity level was excellent. I mean, it ran anywhere between, I said 10, but probably 9 to 12 in any given year. And you can't do any better than that, other than we're waiting for the citizens that didn't own land, major landowners, to be a little upset because of the disparity between the level of the land assessments and the building assessments.
When you say equity, you mean quality rating? Or-
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah, the quality rating was excellent. Because the statutes say, the assessment standards say you'll be 20 or below, maximum quality rating of 20. Some texts refer to the quality rating as the of dispersion, so, or COD. And I said, yeah, you know, quality rating's fine. Yeah, so. So we never, even though there's assessment standards, we never pursued the town of Pownell for violating the 70% because their equity level between taxpayers was excellent on the sales. But we only monitor developed parcel sales. We do have land sales, but in Pownell, they didn't have very many land sales because, as I said, they have a planning board that's very effective. They don't answer the phone, nor correspondence from attorneys. So I think that's changing slowly, but anyway, back in the early 80s, maybe mid 80s, probably early to mid 80s, town of Wiscasset, when Maine Yankee, before it became decommissioned and closed, was always assessing Maine Yankee at about 85% of value. But they were assessing residents at about 5% of value. Tax bills in the town of Wiscasset for a residential property was anywhere from $200 to $300, maybe $500 if you owned a expensive home or a valuable home or upper end level home. And so we instituted the proceedings for assessment standards because they were violating the average ratio. This is, and went to court, and it would have cost them about $45,000 to do a reval at the time. It was in the early 80s, and they appropriated $50,000 for the attorney to bring it to court, and they prevailed. Not from technicality, but they prevailed, but because we always adjusted their state valuation, so that way they were waiting for the citizens to say they were unconstitutional, but they did prevail. So we've been a little hesitant to enforce assessment standards if the quality was okay, but we've never had sales on Maine Yankee, of course, and they never complained, even though the ratepayers in the state of Maine were picking up the tab, so to speak. So back to the Constitution. So we covered Article 9, Section 7. Are there any questions on that? So it's kind of a misnomer that town has to have a revaluation every 10 years. No. This one, Article 9, Section 8, currently states, this is probably in your future also, very likely, all taxes upon real estate assessed by the authority of this state, which any municipality is, shall be apportioned and assessed equally according to just value thereof. Okay? That means you cannot assess one class of property intentionally lower I mean, the market may change your assessment level, but you cannot intentionally assess a fraction of your population as, I'm not gonna say residents, your tax base lower than others. In years past, it was common practice, I'm gonna use a colorful analogy. If your license plate was colorful and you were in a resort town or lake town, especially lake towns or oceanfront communities, and you had colorful license plates, which Maine didn't have till past 20 years. Now we have an abundance of them, but most colorful plates were from out of state, and those always seemed to be assessed higher than the local residents. It was a common practice in a lot of towns. But that violates the Constitution. So that means personal property, if you're assessing at, we'll say 70% of market value, and you happen to be doing your personal property assessments, you should be adjusting those valuations, not assessments, valuations down to 70% to just value. That's what you're assessing property at, if you're at 70% as an average. The concept of just value is key to property tax equity. The courts have interpreted just value to mean market value, and the legislature has enacted a statutory definition which attempts to identify important elements to be considered in determining just value. That's Title 36, Section 701A. If we take a second and go to Title 36. 70. Cities and towns, 701A is just value. Is just value defined in the assessment of property? Assessors in determining just value are to define this term in the manner that recognizes only the value arising from the present possible land use alternatives to which the particular parcel of land being valued may be put. In determining just value, assessors must consider all relevant factors, including without limitation the effect upon value of enforceable restrictions, and to which the use of the land may be subjected, including the effect on value of designation of land as significant wildlife habitat under 38-480 BB, which there's no questions on, current use, which is tree growth, farmland, open space, and work and waterfront. Those are current use, those are not exemptions. Physical depreciation, sales in the secondary market, functional obsolescence, economic obsolescence, restrictions include but are not limited to zoning restrictions limiting the use of land, and any recorded contractual provisions limiting the use of the land. The just value of land is determined to arise from and is attributable to its legally permissible use or uses only. That second paragraph creates heartburn to most assessors, especially if you're in the town of Scarborough.
Not me.
But the origin of that was quite different than the way it's written down, but for the purpose of establishing the valuation of unimproved acres in excess of an improved house lots, contiguous parcels, and parcels divided by the road, power line, or right-of-way may be valued as one parcel when each parcel is 5 or more acres and the owner gives written consent to the assessor to value parcels as one parcel, and the owner certifies that the parcels are not held for sale and are not subdivision lots. That was enacted in, well, it probably says right below, but was it 207, 93, 1985 or 1993? I'm thinking it was in the mid-80s. Town of Palmyra was going through a revaluation at the time. I think Representative Bob Toddy, or it was one of Toddy, was concerned that an out-of-state firm or even a local Maine firm was doing the reval. I can't recall which one it was going to assess every skid of road front as potential house lots, which was not the case. But this law came out of that, just from other constituents or representatives sponsored it because they wanted his sponsorship in bills, and that was not the intent of the reval. They were not, I don't think the revaluation company at the time was even using excess road frontage factors, which in urban areas you use. If you own a lot of road frontage, it's more valuable if it's in a built-up area than, acreage in remote areas. Town of Palmyra being a remote town, which happens to be, just southwest of basically Newport. And you thought they were going to have house lots on every road front acre or a base lot, and that came out of that. And it's very, very confusing, and the attorneys that fight some cases in certain towns use it to their advantage, especially the 5-acre part. But we've always said in practice, and if anyone requested something from the Bureau, as long as you're treating everyone the same, if you want to have one base lot in undeveloped acres, for the rest, you're more than welcome to. But
And it's
you've
not-
got to treat them all the same. And if you have separate lots on the map, they are separate lots, because there is no statutory definition of what a parcel is. There's court cases that conflict this statute, and there are court cases that may approve this statute or be aligned with this statute, but there is no statutory definition of what a parcel is. The mistake made in the town of Scarborough is they didn't erase a line in certain cases and make it one lot on the map. They kept it as 2 lots on the map. So they sent 2 tax bills. One is the house lot, even though it was utilized as 1 lot, and the second lot was right beside it, and these were very valuable lots, by the way. We're talking $1 million range, if not multi-million-dollar range. The second lot was considered undeveloped acreage, or had a severe discount. So they felt they were discriminated against certain people, but it's neither here or there. That second paragraph is very, very confusing. But in practice, if you ask anyone in Maine Revenue, as long as you're treating everyone consistently, you may assess 1 base lot and the rest undeveloped acreage. If I've got a farm across the street and it doesn't have a developed parcel on it, or a barn that has full water and utilities, and it's developed, has water, or you're running weddings out of it or something like that, which a lot of older barns are doing now in built-up areas. It's not developed, and it's just a real barn to store equipment or keep some of the critters out of the elements, that can be considered undeveloped acres, but you better treat everyone the same. Usually if it's divided by a road, it's best to treat that as a separate lot. tree growth is the only exception that allows you to cross right-of-ways, waterways, municipal lines and stuff like that. But it's best if it's divided by a road that is a separate lot. But if you're treating, in Elmira, what they wanted to do was treat anyone that had a developed house lot and acreage on the other side, even though they picked that was a compromise, a 5-acre limit, so, as undeveloped acres, as long as you do it for everyone in the same situation, treat people consistently and uniformly. Maine Revenue Service doesn't have any problem with that, because you're attempting to value. If they were to sell that separately, then it becomes a separate entity on the tax bill and the tax ownership, and it becomes different use.
If you're gonna assess it, it's safer to take the extra step to map it. If you're gonna value it as one parcel, it's safer to take the extra step and assess it and have the references.
That was a huge oversight in the town of Scarborough, if you were gonna use that. That was the downfall. That opened the door for the attorneys to, in the law court, to even misconstrue the laws of property taxation with excise tax, but I won't go into that. I'm not a justice.
Weren't those subdivision lots, though? Wasn't the second lot a subdivision lot?
Very, very few of them, like one at a time.
Yeah. Every
Not
subdivision
majority.
lot, so they had to be assessed
No, the
separately.
one of the larger ones, Peelin, was not.
It's not-
But Prout's Neck was a little bit, in Prout's Neck, they were across the street from each other, the private right-of-way.
Oh, really?
It's a gated community. Maine's original gated community is out on Prout's Neck, and that's where Roger Godge lives, or does not live, but he has a house. Roger Goodell, the commissioner of the NFL. Yeah. Tell him a Patriots fan. Okay, so that's just value. I rely on that first paragraph. That second paragraph came about, it was new in 1993. I should just read below that, so. This one is subject to interpretation, as long as you're being consistent and uniform to all your taxpayers in your community and applying the same set of standards. I have no problem, and I don't think Maine Revenue, I don't think the courts would have any problem.
There was just such a disparity.
Yeah.
You got in trouble.
Okay, the just value provision in Article 9, Section 8 was amended in 1876 to include personal property. Exceptions to the provisions have occurred only 3 times. In 1970, Maine voters approved an amendment allowing the legislature to establish current use valuations. That was my first year of voting. I can almost remember that, and I've actually found the original ballot for that in the Maine legislature. Actually, the ballot went out and asked the Maine residents whether they wanted to support current use valuations for large landowners. Back in 1970, Maine was, Maine still is, but the larger part of the state was owned by a few or several, maybe a dozen to 20 very large landowners. Oxford Paper Company before, Diamond Paper Company, Great Northern Paper Company, so it was referred to as the paper company law. Okay, it wasn't, the people voted to amend it, and it took till 1972 before the legislature actually enacted the tree growth tax law. Along with that came open space, but that's always, at the time, and up until the past 10 years or so, most people thought farmland and open space was the same law. It was enacted under the same statutes, but they thought they were the same but they're not. Farmland is much more forgiving. In 1978, voters allowed the legislature to approve an alternate cost-sharing formula for school districts that apportion tax burden among jurisdictions on other jurisdictions. So, now what was that called? But the, anyway, what happened was the more valuable towns paid a greater share of the tax burden, and it was fought in the courts. The lady's name that escapes me now, but she's infamous with dealing with the legislature. In 1978, also the cost-sharing formula in education got into the Constitution, which allows that to happen, and the state valuation evolved, so there's equity between the towns. In 2005, the voters approved legislation could establish current use valuation for lands, for laws, current use valuation laws for land that is used or supports commercial fishing activities, working waterfronts, it's referred to as.
Do you think it's typically expected that we know dates of when these laws came in, or
No.
just kind of to know what the laws?
Just know what the laws are. This is just giving you the background.
Yeah.
It fills time. And it's great if you have to get up in front of the legislature, the director can recite all these things and inform the legislature, because there's term limits, and with term limits goes a lot of power, but it also goes, a lot of institutional knowledge goes out the door, so, sometimes legislators have to be, and assessors should know, how these laws have evolved. So if they want to get involved in changing it, this is what's gone wrong, and
I understand
it's
history.
from this time of its enactment that, and that's happened with tree growth. I mean, the new law will not allow bold oceanfront property with, scrub spruce on it growing out of ledge to be tree growth. I mean, so, or islands that are not viable to, be tree growth, but others are grandfathered. If you read the law, they're trying to even amend it more,
Good.
but I know, but there's resistance. Swam and a lot of other people, scream that you really can't set this. They actually proposed a 10-mile setback, but I'm gonna go, 10-mile setback from the coast, and that's quite a bit. But they've got to the point where they've got forestry involved. Like, there was a lot of tree growth applications that have been in existence for years on mega estates out in the town of Vinyl Haven and North Haven. Some of it's just, there's some good stand of trees in some of these lots. Some of it's just scrub spruce sitting on ledge. But is it viable for commercial
That's
forestry?
just it, they can't get people to harvest them.
No.
And so therefore, they really truly are not following the forest plan.
Exactly, they're not forest
And
management
so,
plan.
yeah, I'm in that situation, I called in for Tim Post to come
Yeah.
and check it out.
Now, when it expires, like when you run out your 10-year period though on the farmland, does it just automatically renew, or don't you have to, it's not like a reapplication process? Can't they kind of be cut off at the end of that 10-year
You
period?
have to have a forest management plan,
But they
a
can't
new
just-
one.
But you can't, at that point, you're still kind of all grandfathered in. If they submit one,
Yep.
it's not a reapproval process.
Right. Well, it is a reapproval, but it's a
But
Can't we
validation
just
process. Yeah, no, you
end
can't,
at that
you
point?
can't cut the legs out from them, unfortunately.
So we
They're toying with ideas every year, whether to give these people the opportunity to get out without just a minor 5-year back taxes thing. They've done that once before, when they changed the law. The legislature has that power. And, but there's pros and cons on every side. And some of these estates are owned by, or these mega estates are owned by very, very wealthy people. Some of them are owned by families that, you know, are not all that well-to-do, and they're just land rich.
They're pretty much just renewing their existing
Yes,
status
but
as
they've gotta
opposed to
get it,
reapplying.
every 10 years, they have to get a
Updated.
forest management plan, yes.
And even if a forest man, you know, a forest person says, I'm not doing that, and they just go find somebody else to sign
Yeah.
off on that.
But forestry's clamping down on those people that
Thank
just
goodness.
sign off on it. And the assessors should be aware that they can contact forestry, and they will attend to it if it, you know, if it's egregious enough. I mean, they will actually recommend that the town remove it from tree growth. But you have to give them the opportunity to go into open space. But those values can be a lot higher. I mean, open space, because the town can.
The parcel is enrolled until it's unenrolled.
Yeah.
So even if I get busy doing a reval and it's another year, that property's still enrolled, whether I've sent them notice or not.
Yeah.
It doesn't fall off the books or go back to regular valuation, so.
Yeah, there's a
Stay.
4 to 5 step process for removing somebody for failure to renew their forest management plan every 10 years, and it's not every 10th April 1st. It's when that forest management plan was signed. So it's in the statutes, the steps that you take. You give them a slap on the wrist, a $500 slap on the wrist, then you wait another 180 days, and if they don't comply, you give them another $500 slap on the wrist, and then, but,
I don't think it's even a slap anymore.
yeah. That was painful.
Well, my goal is compliance. I want them to be in a program. And my foresters in the areas where I work are very good about calling up and letting me know that they're not doing that plan again because they haven't followed the old one. And when I get the next plan in from somebody else, I let them know that. But there is some honor going on with the foresters about properties that no longer qualify. And that's good. That's they don't want to be, they don't want their ticket pulled either because of people not doing stuff. It's been
That's their
very, very
livelihood.
good. Yeah, it's been very good.
In general, like, I'm an advocate of any program that's out there. I just don't like seeing any of the programs get abused.
Yeah.
And if we know they're being abused, then it's like, why is there no way for us to be able to like sit
Yeah.
down?
And there is, you know, when the application comes in with a new forester, get a copy of the plan, send it off to forestry, and they'll review it for you. And the foresters know that, and they're, like I said, they're not gonna put their ticket on the line for, you know, a non-conforming lot.
Okay, other classes of land that were granted the benefits, current use are covered as farmland, open space, and now the working waterfront. And they evolved from that 1971 enactment evaluations. They're somewhat different, and there's separate sections in the law, but they're current use valuations, and that was a constitutional amendment that allowed that. Although the exceptions to just value are limited to these 3 situations, Maine law does allow for exemptions. Okay, the Maine Supreme Court in 1945 advisory opinion explained legislative latitude concerning the constitutional requirement of equal apportionment and assessment. The full power over taxation is vested in the legislature, including the power of determining what kind and classes of property taxes shall be imposed and what shall be exempt from taxation, and is only limited by positive requirement and prohibitions of the constitutions. That was an opinion of the justices in 1945. Article 9, Section 8 of the Constitution, Amendment 1950, allowed the legislature to apply different rates on intangible personal property. In 61, the legislature amended the definition of personal property so it no longer included intangible personal property. Tangible personal property would be stocks and bonds, and that's what they were bickering over back then. But in today's society, I consider intangible personal property, which some towns will beg to differ. It's not for my battle to fight, but Microsoft licenses. Do you own that personal property?
We
Isn't
own the
it? Isn't it?
license.
What?
You own the license, it's an intangible.
Yeah, that's right. That's our opinion.
Well, you're
But-
going to the store and you're buying a little box with a little CD in it,
But
and
the-
you're carrying it back to your office.
The EULA, the license agreement the click-through agreement that everybody does specifically states that you do not own the Microsoft product. This is only a license to temporarily use it for a year.
Right,
Yeah.
that's a unique thing.
So, City of Portland begs to differ, because, well, they get declarations, and we beg to differ on the Betty applications when there's, a line for Microsoft. Yeah, but in Unum and City of Portland, they have filings of very, very large companies. We disagree with it, and their council said, well, we disagree with that. It's not an intangible.
I looked it up recently, and there's actually a definition under the personal property of computer software, and it breaks it, I can't remember the verbiage right now, but it breaks it out to, if it's custom designed, then it's not taxable, but any other software, kind of your boxed software was.
Box software is not. Custom designed is taxable. It'd be in the price of the machine that it operates, so. But for Betty, they like to file everything on separate lines, line items. That's it. But, so, I mean, it's nothing that's on the test, but
Because
It's just-
specifically if they made Microsoft a personal product, a personal property, then I would be able to own the source code for Microsoft, which would destroy the Microsoft Corporation.
yes, yeah. So it's not the property of the individual license holder.
Right.
That's our opinion. There's some jurisdictions where it gets buried in the, like I said, the long list of property that they submit for, and there are some jurisdictions that do tax it. I said, well, do you tax the computers that's running it? Oh, yeah. Okay, so I said, so that's a licensed piece of software in that computer. You're already getting the computer, so why are you taxing the software that's operating it? No. It's built. Okay. The big difference, I mean, they like to make the distinction, there's a big difference between a commercial operation that's buying thousands of licenses annually and your individual that buys it maybe for the life of their computer, which may be 3 to 5 years, all depending on how often you update your personal computer, so.
Because then you would be able to tax Salesforce and CRM software and websites and everything.
It may be coming that way. I don't, the way the society's evolving, so don't the statutes. So right now, we make the distinction between custom software and licensed software.
The only constant is change.
In addition to the alternative cost sharing formula for school districts, another related constitutional provision was approved in 1978 that reads, municipalities reimbursed annually. The legislature shall annually reimburse each municipality from state tax sources for 50%, which means the general fund, for 50% of the property tax revenue loss suffered by a municipality during the previous tax year because of the statutory property tax exemptions or credits enacted after April 1st, 1978. The legislature shall enact and appropriate legislation to carry out the intent of this section. So, 1978, if any new exemptions were created, like I referred to the veterans from out of state, the state was responsible for reimbursing municipalities 50% of the tax loss. Betty, the minimum reimbursement level is 50%. Currently, the state is obligated to reimburse towns for any business tax equipment exemptions because of this constitutional amendment that occurred. And so, any exemptions, that's why it was tough to get all personal property exempted, because, I mean, monitoring and auditing, would the town have assessed this much personal property? All of a sudden, towns that never assess personal property would be saying that this is the amount of personal property we were going to assess. So, major headache. As I mentioned before, the driving force behind this amendment was the Maine Municipal Association, because it was eroding tax bases in some municipalities to the point where, you know, we can't have this continuing.
What about homestead, does that fall in the homestead?
Oh yeah, it's built into the municipal tax rate calculator. We get reimbursed 50%, but in 2018, it's 62.5. So anyone committed with Trio previous, I don't know if they fixed it yet, is that 50%?
I have some issues.
Yeah. So I expect there's several, maybe 30 to 40 towns that are probably going to commit, maybe more. That's going to have an correction of municipal documents, and hopefully there's enough leeway in the overlay to.
What I did in the 2 towns that I have that are getting 65 and should get 50 is I figured out what it was with 50, and I added that to the overlay, so there's enough overlay where I can just jig it.
Oh, okay.
Trio did release an update.
That was the problem. If the towns hadn't updated, I'd still be at 50%. It'd say 2017 on the MBR, but everything else would be okay. But they updated, now it's 62.5, and it blew up the 2 towns that were fiscal, calendar year, so.
Yeah.
So I just built it in. So we need a little bit more for fixing it.
I was the Trio lady.
I know that, yeah.
But it came out a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, timing.
Yeah. So they're also updating this software or improving it or enhancing it, or maybe not. I mean, some people call it enhancement, some people call it destruction.
You're calling it preparing for the future, how's that?
But it was,
That's why the ex-Trio lady though.
Yeah.
But it was a function of the legislature saying after April 1st, you're 62.5, and before April 1st, why,
Yeah.
just screwed up a couple towns. So
Yeah.
there was no upside to it.
Okay, so the legislature will not surrender the power of taxation. You may be asked that in your future. What that simply means is your town cannot adopt local policy or exemptions that is in direct conflict with the statutes. The city of Portland tried in the 1980s to give certain taxpayers some leeway if they brought a big business into town, which was kind of circumventing the exemption laws, and that went to court and was struck down. Orlando DeLogue, I think, tried the case. He's a law professor at the University of Southern Maine, and Portland had to move back to the drawing board, and a council in Portland, and maybe they adopted a tax increment finance district or something to attract this, but they were going to grant an outright exemption to a certain class of property, and they do not have any authority to that. So if you go to a local town meeting and they say, we want the first $5,000 or $50,000 of every resident to be exempt from property tax, and we are voting on this, and this is the selectmen's, it's illegal, it's invalid, because the legislature will not surrender power of taxation. Article 9, Article 9, Section 9. The legislature shall never in any manner suspend or surrender the power of taxation. So we take our direction, we're agents. Actually, when you're put an assessor's hat on, or you're being paid for an assessor, you're actually an agent of the state, because you're taking your direction from the legislature. These two somewhat complementary mandates have ensured that property tax statutes remain the province of the people, either by statewide referendum or through the legislature. Okay, just value. Definitely in your future. The concept, the just value is the key primary goal of property taxation. Equity is achieved when all taxable property assessed and no property owner is obligated to pay more or allowed to pay less than their fair share of property tax burden. However, since property tax is the product of the appraisal function, and because property appraisal is partially a subjective process, the achievement of complete equity remains an elusive challenge. It will always remain an elusive challenge. Everyone's seen those little cartoons or graphics of your house by the financial institution, your house by the tax assessor, big mansion and so forth, and a little abode by side of the road, and by, in your eyes, and
Yeah, the
The
biggest
banks?
one is one person wants to sell or refinance.
yeah, yeah. Okay, regardless, every assessor is charged with the responsibility of striving for the greatest degree of equity possible. That was a court case. The attorneys, the justices wrote a decision and said, you know, as long as you're reasonably striving for equity, that's paramount. I mean, you just cannot intentionally discriminate or inequitably assess property differently because it's a different class, or they're out of state or non-residents. Years ago, a lot of towns used to have resident and non-resident sections in the valuation book. And it was amazing, the disparity in assessment levels. That was because non-residents were always perceived as being more affluent than the locals, so to say, and in many cases they may have been. They had better access to income or economic scales. And so all taxes on real estate and personal property assessed by authority shall be apportioned equitably. That is very important, and that will be in your future. Okay, the phrase "all taxes upon real and personal estate" is commonly taken to mean all property taxes. A tax levied on the ownership of property is a property tax. On the other hand, a tax imposed on a particular use of a property or a certain power over property that is incidental to ownership is an excise tax rather than a property tax. For example, Maine's motor vehicle excise tax is imposed for the privilege of operating a motor vehicle over the public ways. 36-1482 1C. More than a century ago, the courts sharpened the distinction between property taxes and excise taxes, employing the following two-part test. Came out of a court case, the state versus Western Union. The first part of the test concerns the method of use to establish the tax rate. A unique feature of the property tax, and this is probably in your future, the unique feature of the property tax is it is predetermined amount by the virtue of the procedure whereby project funding is specifically appropriated as part of a formal budgetary process. Your legislative body, whether it be a town meeting or the town council in cities' cases or some larger municipalities, some municipalities that have enacted a council form of government, they have to vote on the budget. It's predetermined. The amount of money, the taxes needed to be raised is a predetermined amount. The valuation that you have in the valuation base hopefully is distributed equitably with your valuations, and that is the denominator that determines the mill rate. And you have some latitude, so it's a predetermined amount. Your excise tax is not a predetermined amount because it's all dependent on the age of the vehicle, or if you go out and buy a new vehicle, it smarts the first few years. Yeah. And that tax rate is set by the legislature, which is always subject to change until they find out the most popular car in the state of Maine is a Ford Focus, which is over 12 years old. Well, the average one is 12 years old. And they go, well, the tax at 4 mils is not a burden on a Ford Focus, but it's amazing how many Ford Focuses are registered in the state of Maine. We actually did a study for the legislature on vehicle registration. So there's a distinction, and that is to get into something way beyond this course. This is one of the problems that I have with the Scarborough decision and why these people keep appealing it. There's a certain segment of Scarborough that appeal these land assessments and expect all the money to be distributed back to them for that they were discriminated against. And the problem is the justices, they went to the business court in the Supreme Court. They went to the business sector, which was smart of the attorneys, but these people have deep, deep pockets. Matter of fact, I was told by one of them, this is scorned earth, we're gonna win one way or the other. I says, I don't doubt that. I mean, they're gonna spend money on attorneys until they get some results. They almost settled, but a faction of them said, nope, we're not gonna settle. And so, but the justices in this case transposed an excise tax laws over property tax. And the problem with that is no one properly explained property taxes to the justices. You would think a justice would know this, but it's a predetermined amount. If you're gonna reimburse somebody for a segment of the property being overvalued, impacting it, it impacted everyone. So instead of giving $2 million back to 60 or 80 or 90 or 111, whatever it is, taxpayers, it should be distributed equitably to everyone because the mill rate would apply to everyone. So,
And the impact that it had on them was what the change in the mill rate would have been had those other
Exactly.
lots been done. So
Yes.
best case scenario, why aren't they asking for what that would have been, which is pennies on the dollar?
it is very much pennies on the dollar, and every taxpayer should enjoy that benefit. But for some reason, the business court didn't see it that way, or they're misconstruing it, so. But that's way beyond my pay grade. Yeah. I've expressed my concern to the attorneys, but the attorneys are making billable hours, so, and the towns are spending way too much money, and the other people are not gonna give up until they prevail, because they have the endless resources, or close to endless resources, to do this. And their legal representation is willing to take the billable hours. to make it work, or to get it done. Okay, I've already gone over the phrase, "the authority of the state underscores the fact that municipalities administer property tax completely." In other words, the legislature delegates the administration of property tax to the municipality, but retains the power of taxation. So, I mean, and a lot of selectmen, when they get hired as, or elected, not hired, as selectmen assessors, don't believe that, you know, they're actually agents of the state. And so they have to follow these laws. This isn't right, this is not what I ran for. Okay, the National Constitution and the Constitution of Maine both intentionally omit the mention of counties, cities, towns, etc. As a result, the existence of this political entities has no constitutional foundation. So your counties and your towns cannot adopt or enable or enact any kind of taxation, statutes or policies that are valid. They have to follow the state legislative and the will of the people. The people can enforce their will on the legislature, but through their representatives, but the legislature will not surrender the power of taxation. So if there's a question on the test that can a town adopt an exemption or something like that, you go to the Constitution and say, no, the power of the legislature will never surrender the power of taxation. The phrase "shall be apportioned and assessed equally" mandates that all classes of taxable property, land, buildings, and personal property, in all classifications of property, agriculture, residential, commercial, and industrial, etc., shall be subject to the same tax rate and valued at the same ratio to just value or market value. That's a landmark, Kittery Electric Light versus Town of Kittery. This is in contrast to other states that allow personal property to be subject to a different tax rate than real estate. There are other states that have, you know, opposing positions on things. They have one tax rate for commercial property or personal property, one tax rate for residential. There's segments of Pittsburgh that have been rejuvenated because they gave different tax rate to the segments where the three rivers converge there to rebuild that area instead of TIFs, and they tax them at a lower rate than the other parts of the city, but that's Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh. I mean, so it's not Maine law. Maine law is everyone gets treated equitably and the same tax rate gets applied. Excise tax is different. That's the purview of the legislature. The legislature wants to change the excise tax. It's in their authority to do that. Change the level of mill rates. The telecommunications tax, the legislature adopted a mill rate for that. That's on your telecommunication companies, your phone companies, and so forth. Equitable taxation requirement does not carry any implication that benefits arising from taxation should be employed by all people in an equal degree, nor that each person should participate in each particular benefit. Okay, that means that your non-resident that owns $1 million property or a state doesn't get town services or kids go to school because they're non-resident, he should be taxed at a different rate. I mean, there are people that brought this to court that, I'm only here 2 weeks of the year. I mean, I only should be taxed for 2 weeks. That's not equal apportionment, so,
With the senior
I mean-
citizens that don't wanna pay for the schools.
yeah, yeah. Okay, the final phrase, according to just value thereof, is pivotal point of constitutional law. Although the legislature has frequently amended the statutory definition of just value, the courts have consistently maintained that just value is market value. And that is the price that the property will bring on the open market between a willing seller and an unrelated knowledgeable buyer under normal conditions. And there's a great case down in Scarborough, Turfloff, that, the courts have, in modern times, in most recent years, have relied on this apportionment of market value. It's down by Massacre Drive, is it? Yeah, just before you get into Prouts Neck, into the gated community, that the properties were overvalued according to its sales price, but the assessor argued that it was similar to all the other properties and assessed similarly, but the court saw it different because they had a market sale that seemed to be under normal conditions. There was no undue duress from any of the parties that they could portray in the court case anyway. So, although professional manuals provide for 3 different accepted approaches to value, the cost approach, the income approach, and the market approach, the method at arriving at just value for tax purposes is left to the discretion of the assessor. This is the Shawmut Inn versus Kennebunkport case. Shawmut Inn was a very resort complex compound, and back in the 70s, oil embargoes, people were sitting in gas lines to get gas, and they didn't know whether they could actually make it to Maine and back. And plus, we had a couple of years around this court case of had very rainy summers. I can remember one summer that, the only good weekend or good week was Labor Day weekend. And so they appealed it, and the justices upheld that the function of value is over time with duration. It isn't spontaneous to the dips in the market, the ups and downs of the market. It's actually a foundation case that most justices use when they look at it, regardless of the effect on economic factors such as the stock market crash. This came out of the Great Depression, and on the relatively worth of property. The true value of real estate should be viewed as fairly consistent and based on measurable, stable conditions over a period of time. Sweet versus Auburn, that's another landmark case. And so the justices, and these came into play during the Great Recessions that we just came, a number of years ago, came through in 2008. A lot of bankruptcies and sales and foreclosure sales, those aren't market driven. They may be in the state of Florida because that was the norm for a few years, but Florida has different taxation laws, but in the state of Maine, it's got to be over a stable, period of time, market conditions over a period of time, which means you don't adjust values annually for a business that one year it's doing, you don't raise it when they have a banner year, and you don't decrease it over if they had a bad year. They had all kinds of cancellations, or there was such thing as the oil embargo back in 72, 71, 72. just value is often interpreted to be market value within the context of the property's highest and best use. You've gone over highest and best use, I believe. I'm gonna nod, that's good. This terminology reflects the belief of market value is dependent in large part on the potential for its development that is inherent in a particular property. Sales data often supports this, but does highest and best use doesn't mean that you live in Perham, Maine, and you have a 100-acre tract that's nice and flat and it would be suitable for a Walmart. Is it economically feasible to put a Walmart in Perham, Maine? No. So there's not, that use doesn't exist. I mean, you could be dreaming or something like that, but it's possible they could put one there, but why would they? And would they? Probably ever know. Sales data often supports the positive correlation between the potential for development and highest market value. However, just value is statutorily defined as the value rising out of the present possible land use. I always look at its present use. If I'm valuing property, I'm always looking at its present use, not current use, but present use. Is it presently an open hayfield? Maybe with road frontage, but I'll put a base lot on that, and the rest is undeveloped acres. It may have potential to be a Hammond lumber outfit or a Hammond tractor. I think there's a Hammond tractor on Union, isn't there? Yeah, it could be potential for that, but it's not presently used for that on the April 1st that you're assessing it.
Right.
If it changes its use, then you change the valuation.
So when you're valuing a piece of, say, land that could potentially, it's hayed, being hayed, it could potentially be field crops. When you're valuing that, it could also fall under the open space and the open farm space. Do you count that deduction in terms of its actual value at all?
Is it enrolled in current?
No, not enrolled.
Okay.
But do you take that into account at all?
No.
Okay.
You treat, just value means you treat that hay lot and that wood lot all the same as undeveloped land. Getting into the distinction, years ago, assessors used to get into the distinction of softwood first cut, a second cut. I mean, they used to break it down. What's the difference? I mean, how can you determine that? So it's best to keep it simple, and especially in rural communities, you have a base lot value or an undeveloped base lot value. You apply that to everyone that has a separate parcel, and then you apply your undeveloped acreage table to the remaining land. You'd be treating everybody uniformly and consistently. Yeah. Don't try to interpret the potential of land or its future use or anything like that. Just nothing but headaches. Making more work for yourself. If I go off track from the real world, please step in.
So Carson?
Okay. Other provisions, Article 9, Section 8 also empowers the legislature to provide for taxation of intangible personal property, such as stocks and bonds, but such personal property is not currently subject to property taxation. But as we mentioned before, the power of taxation remains in the hands of the legislature exclusively through the power of the people, but it remains the purview of the legislature. So current use assessments. There may be a question in your future on what are current use assessments and how many there are. They may ask you to name 3 of them or all of them, and there's tree growth, farmland, open space, work and waterfront. Those are your current use assessments that are allowed in the Constitution. Don't want to get ahead of myself because I thought of another question, but we'll get to it. School districts. Article 9, Section 8, subsection 3 grants the legislature the power to provide taxes may be assessed on property according to any cost-sharing formula that they may authorize. School districts are authorized to issue warrants to assessors of member municipalities requiring them to assess the amount equal to the municipality's share of the district's cost of education. The town cannot refuse to raise the district tax since the town is acting merely as the collection agency for the district. So that rubs a lot of towns the wrong way. That the school district actually serves a warrant upon them in the counties. In some towns, they go, we don't get county police protection, we're at the end of the county. They go, why do we pay county taxes?
Registry of deeds, jails.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, watercraft, Article 9, Section 8, subsection 4 provides that beginning in 1984, all watercraft as defined by the legislature is exempt from property tax, provided that watercraft is subject to an excise tax. The excise tax on watercraft is retained by the municipality in which it's collected. Before 1984, fishing vessels and boats were subject to personal property tax.
Getting double whammy.
Yeah. They weren't subject to an excise tax, but municipalities were all over the place on assessing boats. The fleet in Rockland especially. One final section, the Constitution has been a source of confusion, misunderstanding. Article 9, Section 7 provides all public expenses shall be assessed and a general revaluation shall be taken at least every 10 years. Now, I've gone over this. Is there any confusion on this? Okay. Okay. Okay, not on the test. Okay, so. Okay, where's the rest of it? Chapter 3, Office of the Assessor. Property taxes in Maine are administered at the local level by nearly 500 organized municipalities. As I went over in the past, it's always fluid. Some deorganize, some secede and create a new one. So I'm going to think that it's going to be shrinking in the future. But in addition, approximately half the state's land area is comprised of the unorganized township. The assessment function, which I've said, was performed by the Property Tax Division of Maine Revenue Services under Title 36302. The municipal tax assessor, although an employee of a municipality, is a public official performing a function in accordance to state laws. Young versus Johnson. Johnson was the state tax assessor a number of years ago, back in the 70s. Furthermore, the municipal assessor is directly subject to the control and supervision of the state tax assessor, who as head of Maine Revenue Services has a responsibility that ensure All property taxes in Maine are assessed in compliance with the laws of the state. Section 201. For a property tax assessment to be valid, all statutory requirements regarding the assessment must be satisfied. These statutory requirements may be grouped into two general categories. The first is the money must be raised by a vote of the municipal legislative body, town meeting, town council, city council, and must be done at a meeting that is legally called and notified in Title 36. Section 503. It is important to note, however, that the money raised for illegal purposes, see Chapter 4, is assessed together with legally raised money. The assessment is still valid, although any person who pays such a tax may recover from the municipality that part of tax that is not legally raised. It is not responsible of the assessor to determine whether or not the municipality appropriations are lawful. So that means that you can have raised money by mistake, but it's up to the individual. Depends on some towns, before the school budget is formally adopted, if it's gone into its third or fourth or sometimes fifth iteration of vote of the school budget, have to get their taxes out and go on the last known estimate. Most of the times, the budgets go down, so they raise some money that they were not. But if that's the case, it doesn't invalidate the whole commitment. There's, the taxpayer has recourse to go to court and recover his portion of the tax plus 25% of that legally, so. Most towns, if they do that, explain to the taxpayers that we overcharged you, but we're gonna put that in unexpended fund balance or surplus and apply that to lower the mill rate the following year. And most taxpayers go, the air is human, I mean, so. Some taxpayers take exception to it until they have lengthy conversations with me or their attorney and say, you know, it's gonna cost more than it's worth. Do you wanna spend this time or you wanna enjoy your fall or summer, the rest of the summer, so. Most taxpayers don't do it if the town's, I mean, just transparent about it. And several towns have done it in recent years and been very transparent. The taxpayers are forgiving people. Because most taxpayers, when they realize, well, they're not doing their job right, well, you step right in here and you attempt to do it. They, Okay. It is important to note, however, that, okay, although any person who pays such tax, they can recover that. I've gone over that. The second category of requirements is the assessor must be qualified to hold office as an assessor, in addition to being properly selected and installed